Hello. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for this opportunity, Dr. Barnes. Um, I am introducing a speaker whose work I really admire, and I'm just so excited to talk about this work. I am a second-year graduate student at Brown, and it's been a really nice experience for me to be able to explore different aspects and figure out what is my research interest like. And a part of this journey was when I was being, questioned about the existing scholarship in South Asia on caste. And I remember my initial reaction being, I don't like that work. And it took me a while to figure out whether it is just because of my personal taste, where I don't like oppressor caste, writing about caste and erasing the experiences of people who come from marginalized caste communities like us. But then being exposed to your work and other similar work, I realized that my dissatisfaction or conflict is basically based in the fact that I have this awareness that the history, the theorization, or the articulation that has been done so far is basically done through the perspective or by the lens of people who have been oppressing us for 2,000 years. I'm really glad to have this opportunity to introduce Dr. Zine Magubane. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing. Dr. Magubane is a professor of sociology at Boston College. She also holds a courtesy appointment in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies at Boston College. Her area of specialization includes social theory, sociology of post-coloniality, race and ethnicity, globalization, race and popular culture, gender and sexuality, and the sociology of African societies. Dr. Magubane is the author of Bringing the Empire Home, Race, Gender, and Class in Britain and Colonial South Africa. She is the editor of 2 other books, Postmodernity, Post-Coloniality, and African Studies, and another book that she co-authored with Ritu Mabokela on race, gender, and status of Black South African women in the academy. And her work has appeared in Science, Gender and Society, and Critical Sociology. Her newest book, Another Sociology is Possible, Slavery, Colonialism, and Remaking of Classical Canon, is forthcoming from the University of Chicago Press. And Professor has completed her MA and PhD in sociology at Harvard University. And just to conclude all of this, with all these amazing books that you have written, your work, where on your website your work has been classified, you have described it as you're trying to change through your research how we understand sociology's past. You are scrutinizing the history of sociology and how the existing research has been informed by slavery and the legacy of colonization. That's really inspiring. So thank you, and thank you for the opportunity.
All right, so thank you so much for your invitation to speak at Brown again. Some of my fondest memories are having spoken at this campus, and also it's such a great honor to be invited to speak on W.E.B. Du Bois, who is I believe, one of the greatest intellects of all time. And so today I want to talk a bit about Du Bois and the impact that Pan-Africanism and his experiences going to Africa had on his sociological imagination. And as you heard from the introduction, I'm very interested in the sociology of African societies. I myself am South African and have always been very interested in what sociological constructs, which tend to be so Eurocentric, what, if any, applicability they have to people on the African continent. And Du Bois being one of the few sociologists, especially at his time, who sought to really break through the bonds of Eurocentrism. But the interesting thing I find about Du Bois is how we can trace how his experience when he went to Liberia in 1924 really shaped him as a sociologist. Because the interesting thing about Du Bois is he lived for such a very, very long time. He lived through incredible historical changes. And the nice thing about Du Bois, even though I don't think his compatriots would have described him as a humble man by any stretch of imagination, he thought highly of himself, but not so highly that he couldn't reflect on mistakes that he had made, right? He knew that his observation on the world was literally based upon the world as it had presented itself to him. Just as myself, had I been asked what the state of the American Academy would be in, where are we, May of 2024, a year ago, I would not have imagined some of the scenes that are unfolding on American campuses today. And it has changed my sociological imagination. So Du Bois was very much like that. So in fact, on his occasion of his 95th birthday, he had a big party and he's speaking to the assembled guests, and he said, remarking on his life, at the beginning of my life, I thought we African Americans would lead Africans to freedom. And he realized that actually, given the incredible changes that were coming with decolonization, that in fact, it might be the other way around. That actually, much of the revolutionary energy might actually come from outside of the United States, and affiliation with peoples outside of the United States might be an incredible source of power for impacting social change within the United States of America. So when he's reflecting about how he used to think about things, when we go back to the beginning of his intellectual career, his first essays, such as The Conservation of Races, written in about 1897, at that time, he was being mentored by a man called Alexander Crummell of the American Negro Academy. And Alexander Crummell is an interesting figure, very, very revolutionary in his anti-racism, in his refusal of the strictures that were placed on African Americans at the time, all the assumptions about African Americans and challenged intelligence, all the assumptions that were driven by biological determinism. He had a reasonably strong critique of those things. However, Crummell, in his sort of elitist imagination, had an idea about Pan-Africanism, but it was very much a sort of colonialist one, in that he believed that African Americans were the most advanced of African people. He also imagined that, indeed, it would be important for the liberation of African Americans to make some sort of connection with Africa. But it was very much a top-down, elite-led sort of phenomena. So Du Bois, this was his talented 10th period, and in many ways he thought of the world as organized similarly to how he thought America was organized. And he thought that as there was a talented 10th in the United States of America, African Americans were sort of a global elite, a global talented 10th. In his political imagination, that sort of imagining of a global talented 10th, his sociological imagination reflected that political imagination. So in his sociological thinking, at the time, in general white sociology, for lack of a better word, there were certain governing assumptions about how was society possible. Now, Du Bois was very, very critical of people like, for example, Herbert Spencer. People who had an idea that societies were organisms. In fact, that was sociology's favorite analogy. Societies were organisms. And Herbert Spencer and other sociologists of the time had all of these ideas about what made the society hold together. All kinds of mystical forces that basically made the organism cling, made society possible. So Du Bois, who the sociological establishment had no space for, Du Bois obviously saw the world in quite a different way, recognizing, of course, that this organic collective that Spencer and others spoke about, whether it's E.U.A. Ross and other American sociologists as well, that organic whole excluded a significant part of the population. It excluded African Americans civically, socially, in all manner of respect. So Du Bois, as he wrote in this famous essay, Sociology Hesitant, where he talked about, Spencer and others who believed that this magic organism coheres because it simply must. And when he pointed out that some of the sources of social solidarity that made that organic collective hold together was racism as a significant social force, a significant source upon which white Americans bonded. The racist laws that made the economy work as it did to the benefit of whites. He noted that racism was a form of social solidarity for whites that basically made America as an organic collective possible. So he's got this sort of critique of organic collectivism. At the same time, he has a strong critique of sociology. He notes that the way in which sociology is able to make its so-called universal propositions was by excluding African Americans as objects of inquiry and also Africa as a space on the globe. And he notes that this is a significant detriment to American sociology. And in fact, he pleads, he says, it is only, in fact, through the study of African Americans that sociology will have the necessary knowledge to make universal theoretical propositions. Right? So he begins thinking through, the real poverty of American sociology because they do not consider, because race is such a charged topic, there are huge fields of sociology that are excluded from purview. Right? So he notes this for studying the United States society domestically, but he also notes that it tends to make American sociology very, not even Eurocentric, America-centric, absolutely not global. Right? So early on in his life, he has this strong critique of sociology's Eurocentrism. He has a strong critique of its fetishization of whiteness. And he also has a strong inkling that liberation inside the United States would somehow be connected to Africa. His early experiences, again, it's at the earlier part of his career, it's just an inkling. He talks about growing up in Great Barrington and seeing pictures of Africans depicted very negatively in his school books, but he also notes that his mother used to sing him this lullaby with just a few African words in it, hearkening back to his ancestors. And so he wishes to make this connection with Africa, although recognizing that he was very much American, but it's always in his mind about what that connection with Africa might mean. So he has his first experience with a Pan-African conference in 1919, right? On the heels of World War I, he has written African Roots of War, so he is again beginning to think about the real importance of Africa on the world map, Africa's importance to geopolitics. However, when he goes to that first Pan-African conference, it is, he later reflects on this. He doesn't actually think about it that much at the time, but he reflects later how elite-led it was, right? It had a very strong critique of racism. However, that critique of racism was very much written from a particular class perspective. So the people that he meets at that Pan-African Congress, although they have a radical anti-colonial imagination, they really do not have a notion, one, that mass struggle is an important thing, right? So even Du Bois does not really have this idea in his head yet. They do not have a strong notion of the fact that there are other cleavages and dividing lines in society other than racial, right? So they are aware that the color line belts the world, but they are not so aware of the fact that internal class differences also will be a point of contention in any revolutionary struggle. And again, because it is so elite-led, they don't have such a strong critique of global capitalism. Rather, it's much more of a thought that you will have an independent nation, but it will still be essentially a market economy in that nation, right? They don't really have a strong critique of capitalism. So this is the first Pan-African Congress that he goes to. He then goes to Liberia in 1924, and it is a profoundly transformative experience. He actually goes, again, in a much more official sort of government type of capacity. He goes in a pretty elite position, right? And he realizes somewhere along the line, he's being wined, he's being dined, he's being shown the very best part of the society, right? But he notes as he looks, because Liberia, we're all probably pretty familiar with its history, and especially the history of the Firestone Rubber Company. And so on his travels, he looks at these, rubber plantations. He also looks at the devastation of the Liberian economy when, the global price of rubber took a dive, right? So he begins to be much more conscious of, what today we would call a sort of dependency theory, which of course he didn't use at the time, but he becomes much more conscious of the world system as not only being belted by the color line, but of nations standing in particular types of economic relationships to each other. He also becomes very aware of how the Liberian elite, who were the descendants of the Americans who had been sent to Liberia when America created it as a sort of their colony to send emancipated slaves, he realizes that there is a big class structure in the country of Liberia. And he begins to be aware that even with the elimination of the race problem, potentially, class cleavages within colonial societies were not something to be overlooked. So again, he realizes in some ways, he begins to rethink his own positions. He had rejected organic collectivism as a larger explanation of American society. But he had sort of held on to this idea that amongst people of color, a sort of special organic collectivism was at work, right? So again, even though he rejected the idea that American society mystically or naturally held together, he did kind of hold on to this idea that, people of color, because of being similarly situated as oppressed, had a natural bonding together. And to some extent that was true, that especially during, Jim Crow, when a similar social force is bearing down on you, the internal differences, seem to be of less importance. But going to Africa, again, he begins to think about what are the implications of the internal class strife within any particular society, right? So this is in 1924. Of course, he writes, Black Reconstruction in the 1930s, which is, a strong text that is influenced by ideas about class analysis, right? So what we see, again, with Du Bois, a sort of shifting of his sociological imagination. Even, again, given his experience in the United States, especially his experience of how racist the labor movement was, although he had a strong interest in the ideas that existed in Marxian sociology, he, of course, had a strong notion that racism and capitalism were strongly intertwined. He had clear ideas that, class divisions were important analytically, right? But at the same time, he was quite forthright about the fact of a certain hesitancy around Marxist analysis because of having experienced the racism of the American labor movement, right? So again, even in the Scottsboro case, when he saw the communists organizing, he kind of writes in Crisis that for African Americans to full-on fall in with the communist movement might actually be madness and sure death, right? So what we see here is a person not only struggling in the real world with real political situations, but also it working in his sociological imagination. His notion of not only what makes society possible, but what are the relevant social forces that an analyst should look at in seeking to understand social stability, social change. What are the forces that are necessary to bring about social change? So in the 40s, what we see with Du Bois is a really very, very profound shift in his sociological imagination. He goes to yet another Pan-African conference in 1945. This one is quite different from the two previous ones he'd been to before. So he went in 1919, there's another one around 1927. The one in 1945 is quite different. One, there are many, many more African people there. Secondly, there are African people of diverse social classes there. Third, at this conference, that he meets people in London who are of an extremely radical bent, but and have a strong notion of societies as made up of classes and class struggle. The difference is, it's not white American Marxists that he's meeting. He is meeting people like C.L.R. James. He is meeting people like Kwame Nkrumah. He is meeting people who have a Marxist take on society, but who are from colonized societies. So who have a radically different reading of the intersection of class and race than the people who were using class analysis in the United States. So he goes to this Pan-African Congress. He meets people like George Padmore. So he meets people from Trinidad. He meets people like C.L.R. James. Again, he meets people who are coming from the African continent. And he's particularly struck by meeting young socialist activists who were not only involved in anti-imperialist struggle, but these anti-imperialist struggles were very much bottom-up rather than top-down, right? So a crucial element that is introduced into Du Bois's sociological imagination is this idea of, the incredible power of working class struggle, right? Because again, he is now meeting people from a context where the majority of the working class is people of color, right? So some of the skepticism he had around class organizing in the United States, which was a labor movement that was riven by racism, he has exposure to people where the labor movement is the leading edge of the anti-colonialist struggle. And so this, for Du Bois, again, has an incredible impact on how he thinks about things politically, but it also has an incredible impact on how he begins to complicate and deepen this idea that the color line is, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Because in meeting these anti-imperialist activists, right, he becomes much more aware because they are much more aware of how in their own societies there was an indigenous elite that was very much tied to the colonial powers, right? So he meets people, for example, from places like West Africa, that the British ruled by something called indirect rule, which meant creating a class of indigenous functionaries, indigenous elites to carry out the colonial mandate. And he also sees that within the anti-colonial struggle, already there are emerging within those struggles the importance of people who have a common vision of overthrowing colonial rule, but because they're coming at it from different class standpoints, have a radically different imagination of what society should be like after. So you have people who are relatively better positioned within the colonial elite, who of course, again, are excluded because of colonial laws, but see for themselves to become the natural rulers of the post-colonial state, and sometimes imagine a post-colonial state that is still tied into the world capitalist system, tied in with their colonial rulers. It's just that the color of the ruling class has changed, right? And of course, he meets people who have a radically different imagination from that. They realize colonialism must not only be overthrown, but you have to engage in a very serious struggle against capitalism, right? So in essence, although again, he didn't call it that, we see him engaging in ideas that today we would call racial capitalism, right? And I believe that his experience watching the evolution of Pan-Africanism and meeting people who were involved in anti-colonial struggles, who were keenly aware of the color line being but one of the important dividing lines, and people who, given the nature of their struggle, that unlike African Americans who liberation would mean being a civically recognized minority within a white majority society, these people who were struggling against colonialism, the end point of their struggle would be that they had a nation state to call their own. So some of the issues that they were dealing with, or some of the questions that were facing them, like what kind of national economy are we going to have, were questions that they could grapple with that were much more immediate, apparent, and that they were grappling with, which were at one remove from the civil rights struggle, right? The civil rights struggle, as strong as it was, and as radical that its aims were, the idea that you could take over the American state, or the power of the civil rights movement to transform how America was positioned in the global economy, it simply was not the same as a person who is, once I get my liberation, I am going to be the leader of a nation state. What he also recognizes in the last few minutes is a different idea about what are the social forces that can bring about liberation. So, as much as he was critical of American sociology and how America-centric and Eurocentric it was, it took that experience of meeting with people engaged in anti-colonial struggle for his sociology to truly take on its global dimensions. And one of those global dimensions that it took on was a notion of transcending the nation state as an agent of struggle. So, for example, within United States borders, you are always going to be a minority. But seeing, for example, if a country like Ghana gained its independence, what were the possibilities that the diaspora could be much more closely articulated to its brothers and sisters on the continent? So again, in his mind, part of what he begins thinking about is, indeed, we are a national minority, but if you are connected to a global majority, in what way can the people who are on the continent how can we become part of one struggle? And he's very much influenced in his thinking, again, by what happens in India. And he notes the fact that, when India gains its independence, Indians in South Africa, Asians in South Africa, were still being pushed down by the yoke of apartheid. And he noted how impactful it was when when India achieved its independence, speaking on behalf of Indians in South Africa. And so again, he begins to think about what might the possibilities be on a global scale. And I think we've seen even the smallest bit of this in recent weeks or months when South Africa brings the case of Palestine to the International Criminal Court, right? Is it possible for that type of global solidarity to not just be an idea in the mind, but actually the global South, what kind of political connections can they make in order to affect change in a different nation state, right? So again, for a sociologist thinking globally, previously social forces, for the most part, were internal to the social organism. So he much more begins to change his sociological imagination to think of social forces as not trapped by the container of the nation state, but again, race as a medium or race as a point of solidarity that can actually be a rallying point for social movements that can, again, social forces suddenly are not necessarily trapped within the nation state as a container, right? So I guess, I have like 4 minutes. So again, I think I would just like to, just words of conclusion that, Du Bois, he starts out his life in one way. He studied Hegel, he studied in Germany, and of course we know famously Hegel said Africa had no history. The influence of Hegel's beliefs on our conceptual architecture as social scientists is stronger than we sometimes realize. Because one of the things that we got from Hegel's notion of parts of the world that were historical and parts of the world were not historical, Hegel also had this idea about parts of the world about which universal propositions can be made, and parts of the world that represented universality with a capital U. Social science, which is supposed to talk about, like when we talk about like social scientific laws, or what good social science is that it can give you a notion about general social processes. When sociologists talk about theory with a capital T, it's supposed to be theories about universal social processes. But in that Hegelian view of the world, there are not only universal propositions, there are peoples who are represented as universal, and others who are represented as particular. So white and Western is universal. Anything Africa, Black, female, other is particular. So at the earliest part of Du Bois's critique of Hegel, like when he first says, can't American sociology at least get its act together and actually see that you have on your shores a group of people who is dynamically changing, who has gone through incredible historical experiences. He asked, cannot American sociology look to the Negro problem to generate universal sociological propositions? And he really took sociology to task for that. And so part of his growing, why I admire Du Bois so much was he was able to turn that critique on himself and see the extent to which his own imagination for part of his sociological career, even though he rejected much of what Hegel said, little bits of Hegel carried on in his thinking. And again, that exposure to meeting people who were from Africa, to be able to see that not only was it the case that African Americans could be the basis for making universal sociological propositions, but people of African descent around the world and the continent of Africa and what happened there could also be the basis for making universal sociological propositions, for understanding social change, for understanding social problems, for understanding social conflict, for understanding not only what makes society possible, but what makes society possible on a global scale. Thank you. So, questions?
Just wanted to make an FYI. Your session actually goes until 8:45, so we have plenty of time for questions.
All right. But I'm sensitive. It's, it's 8:08 on a Friday, so I don't want to push my luck too much.
Zine Magubane, thank you for your decade plus of consistent, rigorous scholarship, your commitment to publishing your work and writing so vigorously, but also doing the important and hard work of being able to distill these big ideas down to the lowest common denominator so folk like me can sit here and just enjoy the show. So thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Sure.
I'm also thinking about, as you talk about Du Bois's expanding and evolving Pan-Africanism, and how that influenced his sociological imagination. I'm also thinking about, in tandem, how his, I won't even call it imagination, but fantasies about an Afro-Asian coalition as a pathway for global liberation and freedom for all oppressed peoples, centering people of color, and very much in relationship with articulating an East Asian people of color solidarity. I would love to hear your remarks on how these two very different articulations that he imagined and or fantasized about simultaneously shaped then his sociology in ways that were cohesive and helpful, and also ways that were contradictory and broke down?
That's a great question. So, I mean, again, I like that it was a sociological fantasy, because even one of the novels, like Dark Princess, right, was kind of based on a love story that was going to play out this Afro-Asian solidarity, right? So again, as he's thinking about what are nations that are gaining in power, nations that have resources, right? Because he's so strongly aware of the limitations of what you can accomplish as a minority within a particular nation state. And this idea of moving beyond just Africa and the African diaspora, because again, when he says that the color line, he includes Africa, Asia, he realizes that the color line is that the world is structured very much around a binary of white and non-white, right? So he has this, again, as you said, this idea about Afro-Asian solidarity. And I think, I guess to jump a little, or to play with the question a little bit, I think about what impact it would have on his sociological imagination if he were alive today. Because at the time that he was writing, China, which was a place that he had good experiences and a great deal of positive feelings about. I can certainly tell you, as a person who has lived and worked in Southern Africa and been to a number of other African countries, the relationship between China and Africa is a complicated and vexed one. Like what I have seen, in terms of investment on the African continent from China, there is quite a bit, but much of it is done to meet the imperatives of the Chinese economy rather than any of the economies that they rather than any of the places they are invested in. So I think, were he alive today, it would have a different impact on his sociological imagination than it had at the time. I think, again, at the time, it further reinforced for him the importance of mass struggle politically and analytically. That, he previously had an idea about social change, very elite-led, very elite-directed, and in some sense, social change coming about through this idea of when people know better, they do better. Like this thing of, like at the beginning of his career, he thought it was sufficient to simply prove that scientific racism was wrong, meaning not wrong morally, but literally wrong intellectually, and then people would think better thoughts and do better things. And what he, of course, found out was that no matter how much you prove that it is false, it didn't change anything. So he began to think, race is not just an idea. It is much more of an ideology, and every ideology has what is the motive of the ideology, who has created it, who has shaped it, and for what ends. So he realized that this ideology was ultimately for the reason of realizing profits, like gaining profits. He also realizes that this sort of idea of you prove it to people intellectually, and then it makes society changes. He moves away from that sociologically. So if it is not getting the elites to think differently and change their behavior that makes the world change, well, what is the social force that makes the world change? And that's where we see a Du Bois who becomes much more interested in mass struggle as like an interesting sociological phenomena, that perhaps this is the force that makes societies change, right? So I guess like the long way round about your question is, at the time that he was writing, I think he saw in that Afro-Asian connection not only a global people of color, but a global working class, a global class of people who didn't have to beg the elites for power or appeal to their intellect or morals, but could do something like if we are the dock workers and we decide not to unload the ships won't get unloaded, and then the people will have to change, right? And so I think, yeah, that's how it impacted a sociological imagination, that you could actually have this global and very, very large working class as a lever of social change.
Like Karita Brown, I'm a fan.
Likewise, right back at you.
I love the way your work is pushing the boundaries. And I'm going to take this opportunity to push back a little bit on the Afro-Asian connection. I do not think by the time of his visit to China, I think it was 1959, that it was a fantasy at all. That he was very influenced by the Communist Revolution in China. And he was very much influenced by the what had happened in the Soviet Union.
True.
And he took the position in 1959 that it was China that had unlocked the secrets to human emancipation. He told Africa, I'm going to speak on this tomorrow, but he told Africa, look to China. And as you said, he was also very much influenced by what had happened in India. And so this was no fantasy. I agree with you that if he were writing about it now, he could have a different perspective, but we got to deal with what he was writing then. And he definitely used the Afro-Asian kind of thing as something real in his mind, and that it could be the transformative force to human emancipation.
Yeah, I agree, actually. I think the fantasy, I was thinking more of the book, Dark Princess. But you're absolutely right. Like, profound impact of the independence of India and seeing what was happening in China. And again, that idea that, like, the United States is not all that. Like, it is not the be-all at the end of the world. And again, at that time, the United States was strong, but these places were strong too. Like, it was not that end of history yet, United States. The non-aligned movement, like there was the idea that the third world, the global South, third world, they would call it, was percolating. The possibilities were fresh. And so I agree, yeah, definitely.
Zine,
Hello,
good to have you back
so
at
many
Brown.
friends in the audience.
Yes.
Great to see you.
Okay, I just got back from a huge, wonderful conference in Trinidad.
The CLR James conference.
No, this was Oliver Cox.
Oh, right, the Oliver Cox, Carol
Oliver
Boyce
Cox
Davies.
conference. And one of the big questions that came out of this conference was Oliver, in his book, The Foundations of Capitalism. Lots and lots of people just don't know his trilogy on capitalism. 3-volume, massive 3-volume work. But in any event, for Cox, the origins of capitalism, right, is in primitive accumulation. And the question that came out of this conference was a question that he posed in The Foundations of Capitalism. And well, of course, he had the whole world system thing worked out long before Wallerstein. And as a matter of fact, Wallerstein himself, there were several people who made this quote, where he publicly admitted that Cox developed the world system theory before him. So in any event, though, he had this world system, and within it, he had nations in a variety of hierarchical positions. And so he didn't just have a simple periphery, semi-periphery. He had what he called progressives, colonies, and a whole host of things. And at the bottom were the passives, the people who were just completely not engaged in primitive accumulation. They were being primitively accumulated. They were the victims of primitive accumulation. So the question he asked was, if you are a colony, particularly if you are primitive, you are passive, can you develop without going imperial? Do developing countries, including the African Americans, do they need a primitive accumulation project if they are going to climb out of capitalist domination? Because he's looking at Japan and other countries, and we're talking about China now. And what's different about China is that China has developed, I wouldn't call it an imperial project, but a primitive accumulation project. And so I would say this was one of the big questions that came out of this conference. So of course, a lot of people were saying, well, the Belt and Road Initiative of China is just another imperial project. And there were those also saying, well, no, look at how it evolved, right? China was, and what's really interesting for us was that China, the first phase of China's development since 1978, was using the theories of Arthur Lewis, Caribbean economist, development with unlimited supplies of labor. And that model required an external market. And that external market was the US, and in particular, Walmart. Yes. It's true. Very much. And then what happened? China began to get too powerful, and the United States started to close it down. So the market for China, if they were going to continue with the Lewis model, the first attempt with the Lewis model, they lifted literally 500 million people out of poverty. But that's just half the number of poor people in China. So what are you going to do to lift the remaining 500 million people out of poverty? And that's the origin of the Belt and Road Initiative. They need more markets. And so this was Cox's claim, that if you're a modern society, right, even though you may say you're a socialist, this process of primitive accumulation is something you have to tackle. And so this was, I would say, one of the heated. Look at us in the Caribbean. We're tiny, right? Do we have to develop an imperial project? Do we have to come up with an army and take some? Okay, the Bahamas, we're coming in, we want your markets, we're going to semi-colonize you, right? And Cox really raised this question in a very sharp and pointed way. And I don't think anybody has taken him seriously on that. But it came out as we were discussing the role of China and Chinese investments in the Caribbean and in Africa. So I was just curious, what your thoughts were. Yeah.
You're just learning about this, huh?
No, I mean, everybody's talking about the role of Chinese investments. I mean, it's they're banning, TikTok, Huawei, all of this stuff. How China is going to acquire the markets it's going to need for its industries. Is this necessarily imperial? Or is there a way that they can expand without being imperial? I think that, to me, is the key question, that comes out of the Belt and Road Initiative. And from where, well, I mean, there are lots of people who were interested in other things, we had lots of stuff from Cox on gender and stuff like that. But for me, as somebody who works in the field of economic development, that for me was the question that came out of this conference. How can we expand, acquire markets, and not be imperial?
Well, what is your thought about internal markets? Okay, because some of the countries you're talking about are quite small, but I think about like South Africa or some of these, other places on the continent that China has such a presence, right? Like, these places are not, for example, they're unable to develop their own clothing industry to clothe their own people because you can never compete with how cheap the things are coming from outside. Like even South Africa, we have such high unemployment, and it's cheaper to get the things from outside. And also, again, I also think about South Africa's internal structure. It is one of the most unequal countries in the world, and it is our own elites who that's their development strategy. They're not interested in equalizing South Africa such that South Africans could be, it's a very young country. We have a lot of people. We have a lot of consumer demand, but we have such high unemployment, people can barely survive, so they tend to import all these products from outside. I guess my question is about where does the unequal economic distribution inside of these places impact the possibility of you having an internal market to supply to be the source of your growth? Why do you always have to sell it, get it from someplace else? Yeah, and I guess, like knowing what is going on in South Africa and Southern Africa, the relationship to China, which is very much facilitated by the ANC of now, is also an ANC of now that is not committed to making our own society more equal. There's so much primitive accumulation of our own people by our elite.
Well, okay. Just to be brief, I don't know if you're talking about.
So I don't have a great answer, but that's all I...
Yeah, but no, the reason why most countries end up going overseas, right, is for reasons that you just mentioned, that the internal market, right, is too small to support it. Second, the resource base of the country may be such that you cannot get all of the ingredients, the inputs that you need to keep your industry going. So that I need your iron, I need your bauxite, or something like that. And so what Cox is trying to tell us is that let us look a little bit more carefully about why so often we go overseas, right? That it may not all be imperialistic, that there are genuine reasons, good reasons, but we have to work them out in an equitable and humane way. As a matter of fact, I can't remember who it was, but anyway, one of these Enlightenment philosophers said that international trade is a humanity. Yeah, he said international trade should be one of the humanities. Yeah, and that's how we should look at it. But of course, that's just so far from reality.
But again, I even think about the Southern African, like, if you think about, do you have coal, iron, bauxite, all of those things are within not just South Africa, but all of the neighboring economies.
Oh.
But none of them are, the South African Development SADC, none of them, it's not that internally sufficient, self-sufficient unit. And of course, you know, if, like again, back to the dream of Pan-Africanism, there's everything you would ever need on the African continent, but all of the economies are directed outside and to the benefit of people outside. And again, I guess what Du Bois's imagination would have been would be what would not only a liberated Africa, but a liberated Africa that was run by the humanitarian principles and ideas of, and a commitment to real equality. What would its relationship to Trinidad be, to Jamaica to be? You know, it is quite, another world is possible, even given the resource base that we have.
Sure. Anyway, I just thought
that's
I
a great
would
question.
share,
And it's great to hear from you.
let
It's
you
great
know
to see you.
Let you know what's going on in Trinidad.
It looked like a great conference. I saw quite a bit about it.
It really was. It really was.
And Cox, another person even more neglected than Du Bois by,
Absolutely. By a long time. And my situation was, which conference do I attend to? do I come here to the Du Bois conference being done in my department?
Should be in the pyramids.
but we have another one.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that presentation. I'm Esther Hernandez Medina, Esther, I'm an alumna from the Sociology department here at Brown. And every time I read Du Bois, and I need to read much more, of course, I'm curious about, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this, the way he saw Latin America in this, of course, in the global color line, but especially in terms of what you were talking about, you know, conceptualizing the social struggle and social change at a global level, right? I'm from one of the few countries that are part of the Caribbean and part of Latin America at the same time, so Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic. And I always thank Jose Itzigson and Carida because they reminded me with their book that when he was talking about the color line, he was talking about the global color line. But I always wonder, you know, about that part. Like, it seems that, and you gave an example of that, that he saw the connections with other parts of the global South much more explicitly, and I was wondering, what was your take on that relationship specifically?
Okay, well, I might have to defer to Carita on that one. I don't know that much, but there is a fabulous paper that should be coming out in Gender Society, which is about the work he did on Latin America. But interestingly, this paper is about a female scholar, I'm just blanking on her name, that he basically disappeared from the work, up to and including cutting pictures of this woman out. I mean, this paper is just going to set the world on fire when it finally, I have no idea who wrote it. I was a blind reviewer, but I was like, you have to publish this. And the person went to the archives and noted that this person was there every step of the way. And as if she was working as, he described it as a secretary, but she had done so much work right alongside him. And she was actually the one who was helping him on that aspect of his work, right? So I don't know the work that he's done on Latin America well enough. Maybe Carita could weigh in. But that is once that paper comes out, it's going to be a world beater. Cuba, yeah, exactly.
Oh, okay.
And so apparently, again, he did do quite a lot of work, but it might have been this person who if she did not do much of it, she also, their conversation, she was an important interlocutor that ultimately he did not recognize her contributions to the extent that he could have. And of course, she has her own archive of work that she's done that people haven't really looked at, that I think will be, you know, important for scholars interested in that, in the very questions you've asked going forward. Irene Diggs,
Irene
yes.
Diaz, okay.
So keep your eye on Gender and Society. I mean, they never tell you if the review, like when it's coming out, but this paper is going to be amazing.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm writing that down. Thank you. Okay. Hi, my name is Shelby, and I am going to switch to a philosophical question. My doctoral studies are in philosophy.
Oh, wow, okay.
Yes, I'm getting my PhD
Uh-oh.
of philosophy at this time, so pray for me. But as many of us know or probably don't know, that is a heavily underrepresented space, in that I am one of few, if any, at the university studying this at this time. And you said a couple of things that I look forward to taking back to my classroom and sharing with my professors, but I wanted to get a little more insight. Maybe it's a question, maybe it's a validation to see if I'm thinking properly, but I would just appreciate a thought from you. You said, can sociologists not look at the Negro and create a proposition for change globally? Somewhere in that context, you were quoting Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, which then actually pointed back to your point where you said in the very beginning, external affiliations outside of the U.S. can help us to achieve the goals needed. Which then leads me to think about the third point that you said, which also ties into racism is a form of solidarity for the whites, right? So in the construct of the society already telling us that Africa is unsafe, Africa is not where we're supposed to be, and all those things. You create a fear instilled into the minority's mindset to think that there's not greater than on the outward lens of what's in front of them, right? And so in that, it reminded me of when Malcolm X took his visit to go out in Africa and changed his whole perspective and such like that. But then at the same time, thinking about how in Letters from a Birmingham Jail, Dr. King labeled these solidarity of racisms as sin, right? As a sin. And meaning, I go to a Pepperdine, had to throw it in there, Church of Christ. So, but not to even force that or push that on anyone, but to be holistically true about that. The question that I'm wondering is, and I just keep pounding my head on, it's like, is this the sin that we're referring to? And not literally in the sin in the church mindset, right? But in the philosophical way of trying to intentionally push down the voices and to defeat the overall masses, which is really us, right? That have powerful constructs if we maximize our external affiliations. There's no reason that many of our activists and strong leaders came back from Africa and different countries with so much more wiser intellect, so much more capability to go down certain paths of change. However, and yet in many of the classrooms that I sit into, those aren't the conversations being pushed out of that. So I guess for me, I don't even know if that was a question, truly. Apologies if it was confusing, but I'm trying to understand like how all of these circle in together from more of a philosophical standpoint for myself. And I tied in your 3 points alongside with that reading that I've done from Dr. King and then learning on Malcolm X's life too, but to where we are right now to just really understand that I've just never heard anyone say the external affiliations outside of the U.S. really can help us to achieve the goal, because at that point it's like a light bulb has gone off because it was like, aha, that's why they've always told us to not step over to these lines, because the moment we're opened, this world is open for opportunity for what we actually built it to be anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I can see, great question, great comment. And, you know, like, especially like looking at the world from the perspective of today, right? Like, one of the things that you need to make international affiliations work, right? Like, social problems, if we think about something like climate change, happen on a global scale, right? Everything in our contemporary world is organized around the nation-state form. And what Du Bois noted or noticed is that one of the privileges that the nation-state holds is the right to abuse their own people with impunity. So if you recall, I believe, was it Michael Brown's family? One of the countless African Americans who was killed by the police, was it Michael Brown or was it George Floyd? I might have even been George, tried to go to the UN to say, like, what is happening in the United States with this police violence? Like when places like you know, your international humanitarian organizations, when they see things like this in other countries, the United States is very quick to talk about, oh, you're abusing your own people, and we have to do something about this. Like, I had the great misfortune when I was a grad student to do an internship at the Kennedy School of Government and International Affairs at Harvard, where they specialized in going around the world and meddling and breaking people's economies, and then being like, oh, oops, right? But there was this idea that Americans knew everything, which has just been so spectacularly revealed as false, right? Like, we were told, I went to school in the 90s where I was told that the United States was the best and #1 democratic nation. No one who taught me at that time could have dreamed that Donald Trump would have ever been president, would have dreamed that you could have like all these court cases against you, would have also dreamed that the media helped the guy, right? Like, he got so much airtime on CNN and MSNBC because it increased viewership. You know what I mean? Like, we were not taught anything about how news organizations were like driven by the people that took out ads. I'm saying this to say, you know, we were told all these fantasy stories about America as the best and most democratic nation that could teach other nations and so forth. And therefore, that the, you know, nation state was the best and wisest form, and this was the best and wisest nation state. But what happened, why would George Floyd's family go to something outside of the United States? Because they recognized that justice cannot be delivered within the United States, because one of the things the United States has held sacrosanct was one of your national privileges is the right to abuse your own national minorities. Like, you know, you don't have to accept global jurisdiction, global places like the United Nations, for example. So to have this idea that solidaristic relationships from outside can impact what's happening on the inside of a nation state, you actually have to have nation states recognize entities above them, which the United States has refused to do every time. They won't sign global climate accords. They won't sign anything because they don't want to be held to account by something outside of themselves. And like recently I was listening, so even things like International Criminal Court, somebody was joking that it should be called either the International Caucasian Court or the International African Court, because only Africans and then like Milosevic were ever brought up on anything. But an international court is a great idea. The idea that nation states can be held to account by other entities above them. Or you can enforce global agreements. So that very thing that you're talking about, it's not accidental that it doesn't happen very often, because everything has been built to make sure that it doesn't happen. As the world gets more global, the nation state gets more fetishized. But like, who can make ExxonMobil, like who can make global pollutants stop polluting, right? Like, you have to have something above the nation state. And of course, the majority of the world are poor, and the majority of the people of the world are people of color. So you can actually imagine why there's very little interest in something like that. Does that answer your question, sort of? Thank you. Thank you. Next. Hello.
Hi. I was wondering, so in Racecraft by Barbara and Karen Fields, they draw a lot on Du Bois, and they even have that chapter where they have the conversation between Du Bois and Durkheim, an imaginary conversation. I was wondering I don't know, if you have any thoughts on what Du Bois might think about their analysis of racecraft, if he were alive today.
I think he would like it, because one of the things that Barbara Fields mentions is, I think it was probably in Dusk of Dawn that he does this, right? Where he has that conversation with that imaginary interlocutor, Van whoever, right? And he's like, how can you call these people black when like lots of them are pale or was white and all these things? And he walks away and he was like, I guess a black man is someone who has to ride Jim Crow in Georgia, right? Like, because he even talks, it's like, I wasn't able to talk so much about this in the short time I had, but in a larger article I've written about it for Alden's Oxford handbook, I talk about the fact that, like Du Bois struggles with this idea about what is racial solidarity? Like, not only what is racial solidarity, what makes us a group? Because, okay, like, what makes a person, Polish or something? Like, there is a nation state called Poland. There is a language. It's a different animal and entity when how America drew the line around what was a black person. The grounds upon which why he would like racecraft is both Barbara Fields and W.E.B. Du Bois recognize that physical difference is not the ground upon which race arose as a category of thought and practice, right? So he totally agree with that. Secondly, he would note, as she agrees, is the way in which America drew the line around black made allowances for people who did not so-called physically look black. Americans have this notion that you can be black without so-called looking black. We have all of these idiosyncrasies whereby, like Drake, he is a black man with a white mother. No one ever says Drake is a white guy with a black father. All of these things Fields points out are racecraft, which also Du Bois was well aware of. Like, he's aware, like Du Bois, it's not an African day. So he's completely aware. I believe he didn't use the word racecraft, but I think he really would have agreed with what Barbara Fields and Karen Fields are trying to do there, which is not to say that racecraft is like witchcraft, meaning it's fake and not serious, but rather, how is it conjured? What are the arenas of life where it shows up? How is the real world constantly manufacturing what looks like real evidence for the imagined thing? And also, the most important thing that comes out of that book, which I think Du Bois would really agree with, was Fields' insistence on making apparent Americans' verbal tic of what she calls the racism evasion. That instead of saying race, instead of saying racism, we always say race. So we say things like, did race play a role in George Floyd getting killed? And she was like, it's the mental prop for the verbal trick that turns racism into race. So instead of asking, did racist police do it? We say, was race a factor, or was it because of their race? And she's like, as Du Bois also noted, it turns the act of an aggressor and what they've done into something about the attribute of the object. Was it done on account of his race? Makes it about the race of the object instead of were they a racist, which makes it about the actions of the aggressor. So I really think, that book is very much inspired by the way in which Du Bois thought about things. But Barbara and Karen Fields have the luxury of at least living in a time and space where even saying the words race is a social construction will not get you run out of town on a rail. Because Du Bois even noted, hey, people have all these propositions about so-called mixed race people and, he was like, I don't necessarily agree with it, but what makes American social science or scientists so scared even to test the proposition? If you truly believe X and Y, why are you so afraid to simply go out and design an experiment and test the gosh darn thing? And he's like, of course, one, the test will never hold, right? It will not hold that X group is less intelligent than Y, or people of mixed ancestry are more propensity to be crazy. All the bonkers things that racists came up with in order to justify the social order. So Du Bois is like, again, they will never put those things to the test, which would have indeed shown that race was a social construction. They wouldn't even entertain it, and you could get run out of town. So I think that's the big difference. They can at least start with a society that is willing to entertain it or at least mouth the words, even though we so often fall back into acting like it's not a social construction, but actually, a biological propensity, attribute of persons. But thank you for the question. I love Barbara Fields.
I don't want to be that person that makes the session go over. I'm not sure what time it is. Should I don't know. Okay, I'm asking. First, thank you so much for your talk. I've been sitting back there thinking about how to word this question, so I hope I articulate it well. At least from my reading of current scholarship on Pan-Africanism, it seems like this conversation of Pan-Africanism as a praxis for racial consciousness, racial liberation has sort of, has seemed to sort of slowed or been replaced by other theoretical practices of racial liberation or racial consciousness, sorry, like diasporic consciousness, for example. Some argue that this is because Pan-Africanism has a tendency to sort of homogenize and romanticize the continent of Africa and African people in general. Some argue that increased, global flows of migration to the U.S. Specifically has also come with different cultural narratives of what Blackness means, what racial and cultural heritage means, what class means, like you were mentioning in your presentation. So I guess my question is, how can we use Du Boisian sociology, or what is the Du Boisian perspective, I suppose, and to understand or to explain this sort of like contemporary shift away from Pan-Africanism as an explanation or praxis to racial consciousness?
Oh, I mean, I think, those realizations that Du Bois was making towards the end of his life about it is one thing to struggle to overthrow your colonial master. You can be very agreed on that. What your society looks like afterwards is where all of the fault lines, like where all the cracks in your beautifully constructed edifice show up and show up very, very, very strongly. And also where, this notion of like, it surges to the forward, like how is your society going to be economically organized? So, again, I'll speak about South Africa because it's what I know. Quite recently, the New York Times had an article about African Americans moving back to Africa, Ghana and South Africa. And it was a very nice article. It was great about how people are finding community, they're making friends, and everything seemed really great. And I read it and I thought, oh, this is nice. So I sent it to my niece who lives in South Africa. And, my niece is not poor, regular upper middle class family, whatever, but much like middle-class people in the United States of America who, like the millennials and younger who like buying a home, all that stuff seems so out of reach. She was like, yeah, it's really great that Americans are moving here with their dollars and jacking up the prices. It's hard enough to ever think about buying a house. I can never compete with somebody who's making American dollars. So, like an on-the-ground, real thing. You know what I mean? Like, my niece has nothing. I mean, her own mother, my sister, grew up in the United States of America. But the reality of Pan-Africanism as it is working out in South Africa in the year of our Lord, 2024, with escalating real estate prices is you take your US dollars that you can't buy a house in Boston, and you can buy a fantastic house in Cape Town. But what about people who are in South Africa making South African dollars? And those are, the rubber meets the road type of questions that have no easy answers to them, right? Like no, and I mean, again, these things, when the society of the future, because even, South Africans would look at me. I got to go away, and I come back with all this fancy education and degrees and can swoop in, and they hire me over a person who went to a local South African university. What, great, you get the job because your parents split? These are the sort of things that are quite seriously at issue when you talk about what it means to do the thing in practice, right? I mean, again, and we look at different ways Pan-African was imagined, like Garvey's project. it sounded very nice for the people that were getting on the Black Star Line and going to Africa. But he had this idea of basically like taking over a place where there were already African people living. So again, even the idea of like going back to a homeland can sometimes mean displacing people who are there already. And depending upon the standpoint from which you are approaching the problem, right? Like, or where your standpoint of how you engage the process, your idea about what is a good outcome or what is just can differ very, very radically. So again, even talking about South Africa and the problem of Pan-Africanism, South Africans have become, Black South Africans, some of the most xenophobic people, and it is so upsetting to see. But again, this idea of they would rather hire a Congolese migrant, right, who, similar to people who are coming here undocumented, you know, will work for less wages, are more exploitable, and therefore people want to hire them. And just like here, we tend to blame, or politicians, or it can be, you can get a lot of traction blaming the person who is coming in to so-called take the jobs and not blame the employer. A similar thing is in South Africa. So South Africa has attracted a lot of people from across the African continent, and they face a lot of hostility from South Africans who were born there, who say people would rather hire someone from the Congo. People would rather hire somebody who's fleeing oppression from somewhere else who will desperately take any job. And that the same people say, we don't want to hire South Africans, they don't like to work hard. All of the same kinds of discourses that we have here. However, they are taking place in a context, oops, please stop, that is broadly Pan-Africanist. Sorry about that. Thank you. Thank you, audience.